Dear distinguished guests of this evening, a very warm welcome to our panel discussion on the topic of Science Under Pressure, Europe and Austria in the wake of Project 2025. We are very pleased that you have found the time to be here today. We had to postpone this discussion at very short notice in June of this year due to the terrible events in Graz, which deeply affected us, and still do. And one might have hoped that the perceived threat to science caused by the developments in the United States would maybe no longer be so relevant till October, and maybe the event wouldn't be necessary. Unfortunately, it seems that the opposite is the case. So let me start with some background information to this event and its organizers. My name is Barbara Schober. I'm a professor for psychological research on education and transfer at this university. I'm the dean of the Faculty of Psychology, and together with Silvia Kritzinger and Michael Wagner, I'm currently chairing the UPV Uni Vienna, which is organizing this event. This UPV Uni Vienna is an association of professors at this university, and one of its key concerns is to promote the cultural, social, and economic interests of its members and to promote science and research. This concern is undoubtedly affected when the current US Vice President, J.D. Vance, said the professors are the enemy, even though he is not the first famous US politician to say this. And he laid out a plan for America's universities, saying in part, we have to honestly and aggressively attack the universities in this country. But Project 2025, the so-called presidential transition project, which can be summarized as a kind of detailed plan for the transformation of the United States, published by the Heritage Foundation, an American nationalist conservative think tank, goes much deeper than the specific situation of professors or specific universities. It affects central areas of society, free research, science, and democracy itself. And you can watch the Project 2025 tracker, which is a web page, how much progress is already made in working on this plan. And if you look at this homepage today, you see that there are already 48% of the goals achieved. Even though Project 2025 has never officially been mentioned as a guideline for the US government, the government's actions clearly reflect it. We believe, therefore, it's fundamentally important to discuss the consequences of this in different contexts, on different levels, from different perspectives. And this also far beyond the question of how many scientists from the US we can now attract to come to Austria and how much we can afford to hire. Even this is an important aspect of the discussion. Every day we are stunned by new reports and hear decisions that we would have considered impossible just a year ago. We are probably in the midst of a historic turning point, not only in terms of security policy, also in terms of democracy and research policy. Here too, we obviously have relied on the US in many ways, maybe in too many. It's important to respond, but at the same time, we recognize how enormously challenging this is. A lot of perspective, a lot of aspects have to be considered, and definitely there will be no simple answer of how to react. This is the reason why we have invited a highly prominent panel of experts today to discuss this. So thank you very much to all our honorable guests for being here. We will, of course, introduce and welcome each of you individually in the specific phase of the discussion. But first, I want to give the word to our Minister, Federal Minister of Women, Science and Research, Eva Maria Holzleitner. She originally wanted to come in person. Unfortunately, In the end, she was unable to attend, but she sent us a video message.
Ladies and gentlemen, Science Under Pressure. That is not only the title of today's event, it has been a reality since the very beginning of my mandate as Minister for Women's Science and Research. Already in my first days in office, the attacks on academic freedom under the Trump administration showed how fast science and its institutions can be destroyed. My ministry reacted quickly. We launched a working group called Joint Austrian Attractivity Effort. We doubled the opportunity hiring for universities and created a program for students at risk. In short, Science Under Pressure has accompanied me since day one. One thing was clear from day one. When science comes under pressure, governments must react. With our perspective package for scientists, we made clear Austria is a safe harbor for science. And today, this pressure is rising again. We cannot watch while vital institutions are dismantled and damaged for long term. At the same time, we must be honest. Europe cannot replace everything that is being lost and destroyed right now. When this freedom is under threat, it is not just scientists who suffer, it is society as a whole. And when researchers are silenced, democracy erodes. But what we can do and what we must do is defend academic freedom as a cornerstone of democracy. We must invent, and hopefully our finance minister is listening to this right now, in research, strengthen international collaboration and ensure that young scientists find opportunities to grow. Because science is more than knowledge production. It builds trust, it empowers democracy, and it offers solutions to global challenges. For climate change to health, from digital transformation to social cohesion. As Austria's Minister for Women's Science and Research, I will continue to stand up for free science, free from pressure, fear, and deliberate political interference. Together, across Europe and beyond, we must make sure that science remains free, strong, and resilient. Thank you.
So, thank you to our Minister of Women's Science and Research. Obviously, she's highly motivated and committed, and she recognizes the enormous relevance of this issue for Austria and democracy as a whole. We should keep this in mind for the later steps of the discussion. And with that, I will hand over to Silvia Kritzinger, who will explain the program of this evening. She will introduce our honorable guests, and she will moderate the discussion. She is a political scientist, professor of methods in the social sciences at the Department of Government at this university. She's also Deputy Dean for Research and Infrastructure at the Faculty of Social Sciences, and her research, among others, focuses on political behavior and democratic representation, and therefore it's a perfect fit today's topic. Thank you very much, Silvia. Many thanks also to the technical team, to Viktoria Nukulovic and Lukas Kreiger for their great help in preparing the event. I wish us all an exciting evening, and I would like to invite you after the official part to continue the discussion informally over a glass of wine and some refreshments. Silvia, the floor is yours.
Yeah, a warm welcome also from my side, and I'm happy to see so many people coming to this important event, Science Under Pressure. And a lot of topics and issues have already been mentioned, and a lot of issues and topics that we would like to discuss in the next 60 minutes and so. And we do that, as has already been announced, with a group of high-level experts in the area. And I'm sure they will approach the topic from very different angles, so we try to bring the expertise from different angles to this panel discussion, namely from a science policy angle, but also from a science fund perspective, and also from a research institution and university perspective. And all of our panelists do have strong ties with American institutions, with the American research field, so I'm sure we will get a lot of insights on this very important topic. Before I actually invite the first panelist to the stage, I would like to somehow give you an outline of what to expect in the next 60 minutes and so. First, we will have an input interview between Michael Wagner and Florian Kramer for about 10 minutes and so, where we'll then invite you to come to the stage. Then we have 5 minutes input statements by Barbara Weidgruber from the Austrian Ministry of Women's Science and Research and Carole Mansell-Blanchard from the European Commission. Unfortunately, she cannot be here today with us, but she will join us online later on. And then we will have a panel discussion with Christoph Gattringer, Sibylle Wenker, and Sebastian Schütze. And of course, there will be time for you to ask questions, so that after the panel discussions here on the stage, we will also allow you and give you the opportunity to ask questions that may have arisen over the course of the different input statements that we do get over the next 60 minutes. But now, let me give the floor to Michael Wagner and Florian Kramer for this first interview that you're going to conduct in about a second. First, however, let me introduce you the two panelists. It's my pleasure that Florian Kramer is here, and even though on the program we have written that Florian Kramer will join us online, luckily he could be here today with us in person. Florian Kramer, for those of you who do not yet know him, probably it's impossible after COVID not to know him. He's professor of vaccinology at the Department of Microbiology at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, and professor for infection medicine at the Medical University of Vienna, heading there the Ignaz Semmelweis Institute. Very warm welcome. Then there is Michael Wagner, professor at the Center for Microbiology and Environmental System Science, and also Director of Research of the FWF Cluster of Excellence, Microbiomes Drive Planetary Health. Florian and Michael, the floor is yours.
We take a seat to make it a bit more cozy, and because this first part is sort of looking at the whole situation from a more private point of view, because a personal experience point of view, because Florian has worked for many years within the US academic system and maintained always close ties to Europe, and now very close ties to Austria, and brings to us a quite unique perspective on the current political developments in the US, which all affect us and research and scientific freedom. So let's explore the situation a little bit together. So the Trump administration has frozen billions in university grants, and is also, on the other hand, funding now incentives to those that align with its political priorities. So you have improved access to federal funding if you say, okay, I agree as a university with your political positions. So it's sort of a penalty and also reward system. From your own experience, how does this political interference affect scientists on the ground in the US? And where do you see the most serious long-term consequences for research and academic freedom by all these measures?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think there's a lot of consequences. I think that the administration is trying to push the universities, but they're not necessarily giving in. There's a new initiative now to reward them if they say they agree to certain things. A lot of universities have already stated that they're not going to agree to that, right? The question is always what the consequences will be for that. That's not clear yet. Somehow my chair is good.
You can also stand.
No, I think it's going to be okay. So I think the current biggest problem, at least if you look at it from my field, from bioscience, right, is that there's a lot of chaos. It happened to a lot of my colleagues that they lost grants, they were terminated, and a few weeks later they got the grants back because a judge ruled that the termination was illegal, right? There's a lot of initiatives in the US that run for 7 years, for 5 years, large grants, funding of hundreds of millions of dollars. And currently, a lot of that, it's unclear if these things continue, and that doesn't allow you to plan, right? And that's problematic if you're in the middle of clinical trials, clinical development, and all of a sudden you don't know if there's going to be money to continue that. So I think the chaos that currently exists and makes it impossible to plan. And in a way, that's less of a problem. It's a problem too for established principal investigators, for large labs. But I think we are going to lose a whole generation of young scientists who are trying to start out, and they have a really hard time to get their labs going, to get their research going. And I think that's one of the big consequences. The other consequence is, I think, a long-term consequence, and that's, science is slow, right? Things that happen right now in basic research, in fundamental research might, result in things that, biomedical inventions that change people's lives in 25 years, right? And so we might see the impact of what's happening in the US right now in 10 years, in 15 years, in 20 years. And it's hard to repair that. And I think those are some of the problems on the ground.
Thanks. Do you also see sort of a silver lining on the horizon, other than waiting for the next election and for other, for a new president? So is there some, aspects which make you a bit more positive, or will it get just worse?
I mean, we're just a few months into this, right? It's going to continue for almost 3.5 years. We don't know what else is going to happen. I don't see much of a silver lining at the moment. There's also a lot of issues in public health, dismantling of agencies like the FDA, the CDC, the NIH, institutions that were trusted and that are now basically paralyzed, right? There are other really problematic trends. I don't know if people follow that, but typically when you apply for NIH grants, the grants go to a study section, it's peer reviewed, it gets a score. And then if you're below a certain score, you get the funding. If you're above a certain score, you don't get the funding, right? It's pretty transparent. They want to stop that. They want to get rid of that bayline, of that scoring system. And that would allow basically the government to pick and choose what they fund. They could fund really bad grants if that fits to what they want to do. And they could basically decide not to fund grants that are really, really excellent, right? So we're ending up in a situation where I think the government is trying to pick and choose instead of having a transparent system of how to do things. A friend of mine was recently saying, he's from the Middle East, he's saying, oh, the government is bringing the Middle East to the United States in terms of systems, right? So yeah, it's highly problematic.
Yeah, and this political influence will also impact the pace of discovery, right? It's lack of funding, it's political influence. So will we see a slowdown in scientific progress worldwide, or do you think other countries like China or areas like Europe can compensate for this loss in drive in research?
I think there will be certainly compensation. What's happening in China right now is breathtaking. I mean, the way they are moving into clinical research, into clinical trials, the speed is just amazing. A lot of people get hired there right now, back from the United States. So I think they will put a lot of resources into that. The problem is currently the United States, if it comes to biomedical research, they're really the leading country by far. And I don't think it's possible to compensate for all of that. But I think China will have a leading role in the future if things continue like that. And I hope that Europe can play a leading role too. But I think we need to step up our game.
And it's not only money and progress, it's also international exchange, right? Science is by definition international. But sort of in the US, you see an exchange trend now, right? They sort of kept the enrollment of international students. Many scientists don't want to visit US conferences anymore. I hear from conference organizers that they have significantly less attendees there. So what's behind this, right? So do you think it's the J.D. Vance, the enemy is the professor, right? And we have to destroy the universities, or is there something else behind this? It's almost self-destructive, right? If you want to destroy science, you destroy exchange, and that's, at least from the outside, it looks like that's what's going to happen currently.
I mean, I'm not a political scientist. I don't know where this government is going with what they want to do, but of course it's hurting. But a lot of other things that the US are doing right now are hurting the country too, right? I think we have to distinguish. One thing is government funding for collaborations, and that's restricted right now, that's tougher. And the US is not funding a lot of research outside of the US anymore. But on the other side, we also have to keep in mind that a lot of the research there is not funded by the government. And there's absolutely no restrictions on what you can do with funding that you have from non-US government funding sources, right? So I don't think anybody is really in practice kind of inhibiting international collaboration. I think there's a lot of international collaboration that's still ongoing. A lot of it is just not government funded anymore.
But all of this must have also strong personal impact on the researchers. So do you see a lot of sort of resistance emerging? So are there specific collaborations, networks, institutions that are resisting political pressures particularly effectively? Or is it just not signing, right, sort of compacts which tell you you should obey? Or is there something actively emerging where you say, because then we could also learn from it, right, by saying these and these networks, institutions, they can resist better than others?
I think basically everybody is waiting for the midterm elections, right? I don't see a lot of resistance, but you know, the universities are resisting to a certain degree. Harvard was doing that, and now they are not signing on to these new guidelines. There's some resistance, right? But it's not really organized and an organized pushback. But again, I think everybody's waiting what's going to happen in the midterms, and that could change things drastically, right? I think the problem that we see right now is that I think a lot of what's happening in the United States is not necessarily based on law and on fixed rules. There's also a lot of things that, you know, people were just decent about, things that you didn't do if you were in power, right? But you can do these things. It's just not, it hasn't been done before, but it's not illegal. And I think this government is good at trying and figuring out how to push these boundaries and what they can do in a legal way and how far they can get, right? And I think maybe something to think about when we think about Europe, and I mean, this is also possible in Europe, right? Maybe we want to safeguard our systems in a way that it's not dependent on on people in power who are nice, but it's really governed in a way that certain things cannot be changed, right? I think that's the biggest issue. And the other thing that you often see is things are done that are clearly illegal, but it takes a long time until the courts push back, right? And so I think the government is just trying to, or that government is just trying to figure out how far they can go. And I think if you have strong rules in place, maybe it's harder to do that.
Finally, before we move on with the program, I want also to talk a little bit about your core area of expertise. So what does this all mean beyond academia, right? If you think about public health, trust in science, vaccine development, pandemic preparedness, you name it, right? That must have, and there's RFK in addition, right? So that must have a huge impact. So how do you perceive the situation? How will this look like, this country, in 5 years?
It's pretty bad. I mean, you know, a few weeks ago, autism was caused by Tylenol. Now autism is caused by circumcision, right? And I'm just waiting what they come up with in the next few weeks. And that's all based on gold standard science, right? Basically, somebody has an opinion and then they try to find some studies that might actually kind of, you know, support that, but the studies are usually not very good. From a public health perspective, you see two different things, right? First of all, dismantling of the federal institutions that are supposed to deal with public health, and then a counter movement from certain states, right? The states on the West Coast have already said that they would come up with their own centers for disease control. The states on the East Coast, in the Northeast, have decided that they would put their own vaccine recommendations in place, and so on and so forth. But in general, there's a lot of uncertainty right now. There's a lot of messaging specifically against vaccines, and a lot of the negative impact of this will show up in many years, right? Measles might, for example, that might be an impact that we see right now already, because vaccination rates are going down, although I have to say they are very low in Austria, and we have a measles problem here too. But there are certain vaccines that people just don't take anymore, and the government bodies that are supposed to recommend them are not recommending them anymore. And this includes vaccines for rubella, for example. I don't know, there might be a few people in the room who know what rubella is, right? It's a relatively harmless virus for basically everybody in the room. The problem is only if you get infected with it during pregnancy, right? Basically, it harms the fetus, and then babies are born that are disabled, right? And the impact of something like that, if you get a lower vaccination rate right now, you will see that in 20 or 25 years. And it's really hard to fix that. So I think public health right now is a disaster.
Yeah, with this not so positive conclusion, we continue with the program. Thanks for these insights from someone who experiences it directly, and I'm looking forward to the discussion tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you also from my side on these insights from the on-site experiences. We now come to our next round of impulse statements, now focusing on the national European science policy perspective. And therefore, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Carole Manchal-Blanchard and Barbara Weidgruber. Carole Manchal-Blanchard is the head of unit in charge on international cooperation with Europe and the Americas in the Director General, in charge of research and innovation of the European Commission. Barbara Weidgruber is Director General for Scientific Research and International Relations at the Federal Ministry for Women, Science and Research. Her portfolio includes scientific research funding, research performing organizations, international corporations, as well as the coordination of the European Research Area and the EU Research and Innovation Framework Program for Austria. And I know that you have just come back from the US yesterday, so I'm very much looking forward what your insights are from your current visit. We start, however, with Carole's statement, and I ask her to start.
Yes, good evening, everyone, and apologize for not being in presence with you tonight, but it was not possible to travel for the time being. Well, I would like to share with you my perspective, which is a perspective both from, let's say, the part of my team, which is in the US, in the Commission delegation in Washington, and also the perspective from us here in Brussels following the situation. And since January 23, we have witnessed a dramatic and alarming transformation in US politics, one that has deeply impacted science, research, and higher education. The Trump administration's swift and radical changes have shaken the foundation of America's academic and scientific ecosystem, with serious consequences that extend far beyond US borders. One of the most immediate effects has been deep cuts to federal funding for scientific research. Still, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, fusion energy continue to grow, but fundamental research has suffered, and agencies such as NIH, NSF, NOAA, DOE have seen grants cancelled, staff laid off, and institutions diminished. Now, the budget debate in Congress have now led to a government shutdown where the Republicans and Democrats are at a stalemate, and the administration is threatening to carry out further layoffs. Therefore, we see that there's a bipartisan support for maintaining funding for research that goes against the administration's suggested budget for 2026. But what we see as a particularly damaging measure is a cap of 15% of indirect costs for new grants, which is something which is directly hitting university infrastructure and complicates long-term planning. So these developments, they have shaken researchers' trust in government support, leading to cancelled programs and halted experiments. And meanwhile, we see that the private sector continues to invest in research and innovation. And confronted to that, we know that with the budget that we have in Europe and at EU level in particular, which is 6% of the budget invested in research and innovation overall in the EU, we cannot compensate for the disengagement of the EU at that scale at EU level. Then we saw also that the administration has targeted higher education through politicized investigation. It has been mentioned earlier briefly. It began with claims of anti-Semitism on campuses and universities facing protests related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict had funds frozen unless they complied with administration demands, such as paying fees or changing admission policies. And now there's a new system that has been introduced, which is called Compact for Academic Excellence, which attempts to enforce strict rules on admissions, hiring, campus speech, and the presence of foreign students. For example, foreign student enrollment is capped at 15%, with no more than 5% from any single country. And also gender identity recognition is restricted to male or female. Admissions and hiring cannot consider race, ethnicity, political views, or other diversity factors. And institutions must also suppress political protests and foster a marketplace of ideas favorable to conservative perspectives. And universities that refuse to comply, they risk losing federal funding, and this has already led to layoffs, budget cuts, and legal battles. So the Compact is widely seen as a tool which is equivalent to government surveillance and control of academia and threatening academic freedom. So in that context, of course, the EU stance is to defend academic freedom, to also watch for the contagious effect that these types of policy in the US can have in the EU, and to launch a program which is called Choose Europe Initiative in order to attract researchers which see this policy as a repellent to carry out research in the US. We also witnesses that the administration has aggressively dismantled programs supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are some terms like climate change, decarbonization, which have been banned in official context, limiting important research areas. And this has been particularly harmful in health research, where ethnic markers and environmental variables are crucial for understanding public health disparities. Researchers have faced blunt cuts and uncertainty. They have been forced to abandon or alter projects in the absence of clear guidelines on how these new political rules or guidelines would be implemented. So this ideological approach risks really losing decades of progress. And then came on top of that foreign students and visa restrictions. Foreign students and faculty have been singled out for their political views, especially those participating in pro-Palestinian protests. There has been There have been detentions and deportations, even if legal challenges have limited the effect of these actions. Visa processes have been heavily scrutinized, including the monitoring of social media of applicants and the extension of application times. And the introduction of the $100,000 fee for H-1B visas, which is a key route for researchers, is heading further barriers. As a result, we see that foreign student applications have dropped by 19%, but this is a decline which is expected to worsen because this 19% does not take into account, well, let's say it does refer to applications that were already ongoing by students. So overall, this threatens also universities' financial health. It diminishes the international exchange of knowledge and talent, and this is going in a very worrying direction. And then the administration has also curtailed free speech, imposed harsh penalties such as visa revocation, and this atmosphere of fear encourages self-censorship, which harms both societal discourse and scientific dialogue. Moreover, government agencies have had public communication frozen or scrubbed of unwanted data or terminology. So the erosion of credibility undermines the US role as a global source of reliable data and is causing both domestic and international actors to seek alternative information sources, but also they have been saving databases that were at risk of disappearing. And what we witness also in a field that I personally follow very closely is that the US is disengaging from several strategic multilateral research platforms where the UN member states have high stakes, which is disrupting their capacity to deliver on the agreed objectives and is harming, consequently, EU and member states' interests. This is the case by the withdrawal from the US of the Paris Agreement, of the International Bioeconomy Forum, and also by the fact that the US is no longer supporting the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The US is also no longer supporting long-term standing marine data infrastructure and ocean observing networks, and is no longer pursuing dialogue on climate and environment-related research topics like sustainable aviation, climate impact on climate change impact on human health, climate modeling, decarbonization of transport, etc. The US is no longer actively participating in Mission Innovation, which is a multilateral platform aimed at boosting clean energy research and investment, and they have reduced their engagement in the group of Earth observation. And finally, in the recent G20 Research and Innovation Ministerial meeting, the US has teamed up with Argentina, pushing for an agenda going against EU policies and priorities, especially on diversity, equity, inclusion, and climate. These developments in the US, they obviously have implications for Europe. So what we draw as a conclusion or action to take for the time being is vigilance against anti-science movements in Europe is essential. And education and public outreach on science must be intensified to guard against the spread of misinformation and anti-science rhetoric, because similar tendencies than in the US could also undermine public health and research in the EU. Then the situation exposes also vulnerabilities in the EU research system and is directly impacting the EU capacity in critical areas such as public health, climate modeling accuracy, or environmental monitoring. Then policymakers and scientists, they must carefully scrutinize scientific data from the US, recognizing the increasing political influence on these sources. So the EU must bolster resilience against gaps in data caused by US budget cuts and information restrictions. Then the US disengagements from international fora expose vulnerabilities in the EU research system as well, and is directly impacting the EU capacity in critical areas such as public health, climate modeling accuracy, or environmental monitoring. But as I said earlier, the EU does not have money to compensate for the US disengagement in all these platforms, from all these databases and from all these research fields. So there are choices to make, there are priorities to fix. Then Europe has also a unique opportunity to become a global leader in research and innovation by fostering academic freedom and attracting international talent. I mentioned that we launched a Choose Europe for Science initiative to attract researchers in the EU. There is an opportunity here. We see an interest. Now we need to team with EU member states to attract to an interesting scale researchers that would otherwise be interested to go to the US. Also, something to notice is that there's a diplomatic window which is opened, meaning that some countries are now more than before interested by international cooperation with the EU than before in the context of the EU Research and Innovation Programme Horizon Europe. And finally, the EU should continue to and invest even more to defend its own technological sovereignty and avoid over-reliance on US innovations. I think this is very much a lesson that we need to draw from this current situation. So we must rise to this moment, not only to protect our own interests, but also to uphold the global values of knowledge, trust, and progress. Thanks a lot. I would stop there and happy to engage in follow-up.
Thank you, Carol. Again, lots of topics that we will probably come back in our panel discussion. Now I invite Barbara Weidgruber.
Dear organizers, thank you for having me. Dear panelists, I already look forward to the discussion that's coming up. As was mentioned, I came back yesterday from a long weekend in Washington, D.C., where we had the Austrian Scientists in North America networking event and the 25th anniversary of the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation, all taking place at the Austrian Embassy in Washington in order to enable a safe space for the networking event, and also because of the government shutdown, making it impossible to have any official meetings, and informal meetings also did not take place because there is such an insecurity that even people who have worked together with colleagues for a long time in transatlantic cooperation did not dare to go for a coffee as a private person. You have already heard from my minister, so whatever she said, I will not repeat, but I would like to point out that what has happened or is happening in the US, and I think we all realized with the Trump administration that there would be impact on higher education, science, and research, but probably none of us would have thought that it would be so quickly, and also really following the project. And what I could also experience in the meetings with the Austrian scientists and researchers, the insecurity is there all over the place. And of course, we all see the very direct and blunt attacks on science and research and the freedom of scientific research. And it's not just the real cuts of funding, but it's also a lot of announcement, and you never know. And I think, Florian, you said it as well. You just don't know if it will happen or not. And everyone has the same feeling. The government is just trying to pressure and to see how the reaction is. If there is no reaction, there will be more pressure. If there is a lot of, if there are legal action taken, then they wait what will happen in the courts. And they will find other victims meanwhile. So there is no opportunity to really plan research or to decide on your next steps, because you never know. It's a moving target. But we also see, and it still is the case, the US is one of the leading nations in science, research, and innovation. And it will, of course, take a while before there is the impact from basic research not taking place. But over years, not just the European Union, but a large part of the world has relied on the US infrastructures, the US data, the US databases, and we were just all thinking that the value-based cooperation would continue forever. So there is actually no plan B either in Europe or in other parts of the world on how to jointly really take quick action to safeguard the data and databases and research infrastructure. But of course, there is a strong joint action between the European Commission and the member states. And of course, all the European research infrastructures are working closely within the European Strategy Forum for Research Infrastructures to find ways also to support institutions who are willing to take over data to take concrete steps. But as Carol also said, of course, the EU funding, but also not all the EU member states funding jointly will be enough to compensate, and certainly not quickly. We all know the European Union structures. They are value-based, they're democratic, so they take time. And it might be too late for some of the initiatives that are taken by the US government. But we also see it's not just the higher education and research institutions that are being hit, but of course the US, and I think it was mentioned before, have been withdrawing from international organizations, also OECD and UNESCO. So all of those organizations now also face severe problems regarding their budget, but also their long-term planning, and US institutions have played an important part in a lot of the activities going on in science and research, also within the context of the UN and OECD. ICPP was already mentioned, so there are areas of research that are seen as not wanted, be it climate research, also parts of humanities and social sciences. And of course, it's sustainability. There might be some reframing of terminology. And of course, private money and international money is still possible. But linked with all the visa regimes and the insecurity, when will the regime change again? The US might not be the option and the destination number one anymore for a lot of postdoctoral researchers. We have actually seen the amount of Marie Skłodowska-Curie applications from the US tripled in the latest call. So it's of course not just US citizens, but it's those being in the US for the time being. So there is quite some interest, and a lot of the Austrians I talked to also made quite clear that once their postdoc is over, or even one of the Ascina awardees who is now in Dresden, who wanted to go back to the US, is already on the market, as she said, and is applying now all across Europe. The second Ascina awardee also applies all across Europe. So of course there is an opportunity for the European research area, but at the same time, the lack of science and research going on in the US now hits globally the international science and research system, and all of us and also the societies will of course suffer from the lack that cannot be compensated even in a joint effort. And it's certain areas, and it's those areas where we, of course, jointly need a lot of research, because it's the societal challenges from climate change to demography, public health, where we should have joint efforts across the globe. So hopefully, at least the European Union will, with like-minded countries, and as Carol just said, we also noticed that there is more interest of Canada now, Canada having joined now the European Union Framework Program. Negotiations with Japan will hopefully be successfully completed by the end of the year. Australia is there, so the opportunity is, of course, that liberal democracies in the world will join forces to then hopefully jointly be able to compensate some of it. But in the end, it's not just about science and research, it's about, and the minister said it as well, it's eroding democracy. And it's something that, of course, can happen quickly. And I think this was the shocking experience for everyone in the US, how quickly it works and how quickly it spreads all across the country. It was strange to see the National Guards in all the public parks in Washington. And I'm actually not convinced that the midterm elections will be the turning point. Maybe there will be no midterm elections, because if there's unrest in the country, we know what the president can do. And it's by no surprise that it's all the democratic states where the National Guards are being posted. And I had a Fulbright in Chicago, one of the democratic states, and I've talked to people, and you can feel the difference in the different states also from the researchers. Austrians are not buying houses anymore, full professors after 26 years moving to a new university. He said they are hiring because you never know. It's not worth buying a house now. So there is this insecurity is quite high, and it's always a personal issue. We had a colleague from the Academy of Sciences, the US Academy of Sciences, as a private participant in one of our discussions. And she said that they should have realized earlier what could happen and should have stated that before, because there was no joint efforts of the universities and research organizations. There was no public outcry, and it was not public. It was public information. Nobody probably thought that this government would actually follow the project 2025, but it was public. It was not a hidden memorandum somewhere. So it's actually something where we should learn as well, that things can happen quickly. And the European Commission is proposing now for next year, within the European Research Area, the first legal act, a European Research Area Act. And as of yesterday, the call for evidence is open until January next year. And one of the elements is about freedom of scientific research. So I invite all of you to take a look at the website of the European Commission and to actively participate. The study just came out on the first evidence on the situation in Europe, in the European Union. And the idea is within the European Research Area to actually find ways to legally commit all the EU member states to safeguard the freedom of scientific research. And I think this would be a turning point also for the European Union and a very important way forward. And of course, we all need the support of the academic community as well, and the endorsement of the European University Association and thematic networks as well, in order to proceed in that way. So it's the roles and responsibilities of the different actors in the system, including practical and proportionate compliance tools is also one of the ideas. There should be EU-wide consistency. Just thinking of one of our neighbors, and now maybe a second neighbor might be a challenge. But the idea is actually to have a potential EU legal framework in place, and that will be within the ERA Act, which is supposed to be hopefully endorsed by the commissioners, by the college in the first half of next year. But what should we do? We already talked about infrastructure, databases, but the tendency, and I think several of you said it before, we have to watch out for tendencies that undermine our European open science and open data policies as well, because the alternative is commercialized solutions, and that's also one of the threats if there's only private money available in the US, of course. We already see the dependency also in infrastructure and in hardware. Just think about the chips. We can either go to the US or to China. No liberal democracies offering that. I mean, there's a little South Korea and Taiwan, but that will not be enough for all the needs all across the world. And we also know that the US government is also using export control mechanisms as one of the instruments. So it's this mix that really will affect research globally. And it's not a problem of the US, it's a problem for all of us when science and research are endangered and certain parts will not be able to take place. But I think it's also a wake-up call, and this was what we had in the discussions in Washington, that higher education and research organizations and research performing organizations should be aware this could happen everywhere. And what are the mechanisms to become more resilient and to support liberal democracy on the way? I think science communication was mentioned, and speaking up every day, because it's the little things. When it starts, there is some fake news and nobody argues against it. And also in the social media, of course, it's no fun to counter-argue. But it's probably important that there are not so many bubbles where all general population then start thinking this is what it's all about and don't take medication anymore, for instance, because that's what their social media bubble continues to tell them, and also a president maybe tells them. So no positive news from me as well, but I think it's a wake-up call, and the motto of our meeting in the end was never let go of a good crisis, so make use of it, and it might make Europe more resilient, and continue also the transatlantic cooperation. Because that's what's needed. Austria has a long tradition in continuing cooperating with countries at risk. We have done it with Southeast Europe at different times and difficult times, and all of Central and Eastern Europe. And it will change, and at least in Central and Eastern Europe and Southeast Europe, those we were cooperating with in science and research then later became ministers. So hopefully this will also happen in the US again. Hopefully there will be a Ministry for Education again at one point, and agencies in charge of research. Thank you.
Thank you for those insights as well. Indeed, these are kind of worrisome information that you both provided to us. But nevertheless, even though they are not positive, you ended your presentation with never let go a good crisis, which is somehow also something inherently positive when we're looking at the future. However, we would like to now start our panel discussion, and after this first round of statements, and therefore I would like to introduce first to you two new panelists that are coming to the stage, and after I have introduced them, then invite all the panelists to come to the stage to discuss with me a couple of issues. I would like to introduce first Sibylle Wendke. Sibylle Wendke is Director of International Relations of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, overseeing the Academy's international relations and research funding, as well as the fellowships and awards program, which has already been tackled before. And she has also been in charge of the Academy's library, archive, and collections since 2014. Then I would like to welcome Christoph Gattringer. Christoph Gattringer is President of the Austrian Science Fund, the FWF, and also Professor for Theoretical Physics, also spending time as a researcher in the US, such as the MIT. And last but not least, I would like to welcome Sebastian Schütze, director of this university, and thus also the host of tonight's event, and professor of Baroque art and architecture, and he also knows the Northern American research area very well, as he has been serving as professor at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada. So warm welcome to all of you, and many thanks for taking time, and I invite you to come up to the stage. Okay, before we start with our panel discussion, I did a little bit of homework, being a researcher myself, just also to give you some numbers where we're standing at the moment. And there are some graphs, some charts that I took from The Economist dated back in May, so probably they are already a little bit outdated, but I couldn't find any newer numbers in that regard. But here is just to give you a kind of a flavor where we're standing in terms of research funding. Just look at it, there is 16% of the yearly federal grant budget that has been cancelled or withdrawn. This means that over 3,000 already approved grants have also been withdrawn. Then we have 25% of the workforce in the NIH scraped, and we have 10% of the workforce in NOAA scraped. So quite a lot of numbers that we see here on this chart. If we continue, then you see here that, of course, if we take the proposed budget cuts for 2026 seriously, then you see that there is quite some stuff going on with regards to reducing the budget. And this will have definitely severe implications, as has already been mentioned before, on vaccine and climate research, on tracking wildfire, sea level rises, surface temperatures, trends, health of earth poles, and so on, but also on weather forecasts and the health of risk groups. And the brain drain we have already tackled upon. I'm not talking about compact because Karel has already mentioned that before, but here you once again see a kind of a overview of what is going on in this agreement called compact, in the sense that, for example, staff is supposed to abstain from actions or speech relating to societal and political events. So just imagine an event like that could not take place any longer if actually universities and staff sign up on that. And here there are already, you see that there are already some repercussions going on. Namely, there is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expressions, who did a survey recently. And what you see here is that there is a declining support for free speech among all students, particularly those students who consider themselves to be conservatives. And actually what is probably even more worrisome, given the current situation, is that 34% of students in this survey say that in some cases it is acceptable to use violence to stop someone from speaking on campus. So free speech, something that the US has always been very proud upon, is somehow threatened very seriously. We have already heard a lot in the news about what is going on with Harvard and Columbia. And here I just give you a couple of examples that even though Harvard is very often considered as the university which tries to fight back, nevertheless they also have already given in, if you want to see it from this perspective, on what the government, the Trump administration wants them to do. So they have adopted the government's preferred definition of anti-Semitism. They ended a partnership with a university in the West Bank. They removed the leadership of the Center of Middle Eastern Studies. They suspended the Palestine Solidarity Committee, which is an undergraduate group. The DEI offices have been renamed and their websites scrapped. And they also consider establishing a Center for Conservative Thoughts. And Columbia has agreed to dismantle these DEI initiatives. And you see that there are cuts to the climate modeling program at Princeton, which is justified on the basis that it increased young people's climate anxiety. So what is going on? It's really that they want to take away the climate fanaticism that has been called like that in Project 2025. So this is a little bit of an insight into today's discussion together with the impulse statement, and now I'm looking very much forward to talk with my panelists. There you go. Now it works. Yeah, we have heard a lot of those aspects and the different statements, but also with some numbers that I gave you here. And I really would like to also get your view in the sense of saying, okay, what has already hit Europe? How dangerous is it for Europe from the different perspectives? Are we already somehow taking actions to somehow counteract that? And I would like to start with you, Professor Gatringer.
So, yes, this also works. Yeah, I've prepared 3 examples where we as a funding agency see already the impact of what is happening in the US. So the first one is relatively straightforward. We had a memorandum of understanding with the National Science Foundation to start a new program for jointly funding projects in mathematics, but with a perspective to also open it up to other disciplines in the coming years. This has been put on hold, and we have never heard of them again. And in the meantime, also the director had to step down. So this is gone for now. Another aspect is that we see, and this was also mentioned by Barbara Weitgruber, in particular in our early career programs for postdocs, an increase of applications, not necessarily only applicants from the US, but many young researchers that plan a postdoc career maybe do not want to go to the US currently and look for new destinations for their postdoc. And of course, we are happy to see that they also choose Austria. And in our ESPRIT program, we have more than 50% incoming applicants, and these numbers are going up. And the last example, which is very current, because we see in various juries reluctance of American scientists to participate. So we had a big jury meeting in June where one of the members was recommended by his university, and this is an Ivy League university, not to travel with only a green card because he might have problems to return. And also next weekend we have scheduled a big hearing with 6 panel members. 2 of them most likely will not be able to come because they are also affected by the government shutdown. They are not allowed to work. They promise to participate via Zoom using their private email and their private internet connection. So these are 3 examples where we are affected as a funding agency.
I may pass the word on to Sibylle Wenker. What have been the implications for the Academy of Sciences?
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation for this important evening. And we, of course, the Austrian Academy of Sciences is a research performing organization, but also a research funding organization and also a learned society. So we have a lot of network going on, and we are, of course, in the middle of it all. And we were able to, of course, we are affected also by that. And from my, so to say, my work as funding, research funding, we were able to react quite quickly to the terrible situation in the beginning of the year, which we did with a Apart USA program, and we were very overwhelmed by the interest of the US American scientists because it was a very quick program, yeah. So we designed it to start very quickly. People had to decide quite quickly if they want to change their lives and come for a quite permanent, well, not permanent, but 4 years is quite a time to change your life plans. And it was possible. We launched the program on 4th of July, and we had the deadline for the 15th of September. Sorry. It was the application deadline was 15th of September, and we were able to have 25 nominations for these 25 positions, and this is quite. It was quite visible how many people extending that number were interested in the program. So even if it's just 25 persons, but it's 25 life decisions we had inspired quite quickly to come to Austria.
Thank you. I pass the word on to Professor Schütze.
I think I would like to start by saying that from my point of view, it's not, the real problem is not, can we take advantage of it or what's happening? The real problem is that, and this was mentioned also in the beginning, that, the sort of global system of science, and this is a real system, has a big problem because the US are simply so important within that system that nobody can compensate it. And that what's happening in the US is really affecting all of us in terms of data, in terms of collaboration, in terms of about everything. And so I think from my point of view, the first thing to think about is really, what can be done in Europe that this is not going to happen to us sometime soon. And this is the first point. In more concrete terms, I think we definitely see what you have already mentioned, that there's more applications from the US. There is mostly junior people, because I would say the senior people are still suffering on a very high level. And so it's mainly junior people applying for jobs. And I think the most important thing we are seeing is that some people that are now at the stage in their career where they would usually go to the US, to the big lab here or the big lab there, are not considering a US lab at the moment and are considering other institutions in Europe, for example. So that's probably, so what we see is that in general, especially young researchers are trying to move in different directions, and it's definitely not, and that's the other point, that this is, so if the US cannot offer certain things anymore, then where do people go? And we all hope they might come to Europe. But there's some other parts in the world that are really investing very, very heavily on this situation, especially China and some other countries. And I think this is equally challenging because if then, you mentioned it, value-based cooperation as defined by the US mainly a few years ago. We were all got phone calls and don't collaborate with this and that and so on, value-based cooperation. Now this is hard to define these days. And so I think from my point of view, we should really think about, what can we do about our system in Europe to make it more resilient, and what can we do about offering especially young researchers opportunities that allow them to do research as we understand it, and that means research in a free academic environment.
Yeah, thank you for this first round. Actually, when listening to these statements before, I was wondering whether we actually got the title right, because we said science under pressure, but actually should be science/democracy under pressure. So it's really a democratic issue as well that we're tackling here in detail. And you already mentioned that, Professor Schütze, that are our institutions actually resilient enough? I mean, we're talking now a lot about the US. We are talking a lot about what has happened over the last 8 to 9 months. And we also have seen how quickly they can be dismantled. We also had the issue about public versus private money, in the sense that we should not rely too much on private money, but then on the other hand, we are very much depending on the institutional setup of democracy in order to rely on public money. So what is your take on our institutions at the national and the European level? Are we resilient enough? Do we have to change something? Now that we do see how quickly things can change, do we have to change something in our setup? And I may start with Barbara Weidgruber on that.
Well, I think it was a wake-up call for especially also the institutional level, and the first step of the European Union to jointly agree on a framework for the freedom of scientific research, I think is a very important step. In the end, the Charter of Fundamental Rights is part of the European Union, but it's only implemented in EU law. That's why we actually have the discussion, because of course it's part of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, but member states do not have to implement it in their national legal acts. So now the idea is to have this common understanding, and it then will directly, hopefully, depending on the legal framework the Commission is proposing, that it has not to be transposed into national law, but that it takes effect immediately, because that could of course help with certain countries that might not be so happy if such regulations come also in the framework of the European Union. And I think what we have been trying, and all public universities are very strong partners in the effort to strengthen the trust in science and democracy in Austria with a number of activities. But I'm not sure that we reach the right people. Because of course with Children's University or with schools inviting science ambassadors, it's those that are more inclined to talk about science and research and to be more open-minded. And actually in the end it's the other part of society that we really need to reach and find ways of engaging in order to make sure that consensus reached in a certain scientific discipline is not questions. And that's what's happening also, of course, in the US. But it has to be a joint effort of institutions, students, and it was quite shocking to see the student number you just mentioned. And of course, enabling cooperation with the respective ministries in the European Union and the EU level.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we do see certain political tendencies also in European member states. Also, you mentioned neighboring countries just recently in your statement, where the institutional setup can also be probably overturned quite easily. So, are we as funding agencies, are we as universities simply caught up too much in day-to-day politics and day-to-day research management and do lose a little bit out of sight this aspect of being vigilant, being resilient?
It's a question to me already?
Yes.
Yeah, so I had an interesting experience which I want to share because it answers a little bit the question you were formulating. I think most of us noticed that part of the parliamentary opposition, one of the parties, prepared a lot of parliamentary inquiries, parlamentarische Anfragen. I think it was several hundreds, and some of them also had some science funding aspects, and they were forwarded to us to be answered. And one of the questions which we had to answer is, how does the FWF characterize the political direction of a funding project, and how do we ensure that the whole political spectrum is equally funded? And then I was thinking, okay, this was fast, because this is a narrative which we saw in the US. This went very fast that it ended up here, and I was wondering what would be a strategy to counteract such narratives. And of course it's transparency. So the answer is we do not classify our projects from where in the political spectrum these research projects come. We do not do that. We base our funding decisions only on scientific excellence. So one of the strategies to counteract such tendencies is absolute transparency, how we make our decisions, and to make this as clear as possible, how science funding works. But this is of course the perspective of a science funding agency.
Very interesting. What is the perspective of a university about the political influences, and therefore also if there is a change going on, then also the implications that a university may face with regards to research and science?
I mean, in very practical terms, research is about funding, so it's about money. And because our funding comes almost completely from public funding, I think the question how a political system might add or cut on our budget is very fundamental, of course, and therefore we are very, it's very easy to act on universities. You just cut the budget and then, we'll just. So I think, but there's maybe two ways to think about it. And one thing I wanted to mention, that this is of course something that's true in all of Europe, and I've just recently had the chance to talk to colleagues in Germany, and for example in Germany they have put together, like universities and research institutions and so on, a whole board of people to think about, what are the elements in our system that are particularly vulnerable and we can protect maybe more than we do so far. So I think a systematic analysis of what our system looks like right now and what are the points of potential political attack would be a good idea, and then to think about it. But in more practical terms, I think what we can learn about it is, in the first place, how to react to such political attempts. And I think one of the problems in the US, of course, was, and you mentioned that, if an attack like that, you respond to it individually, so University A says this and University B says that, then of course you are lost in translation. But what I would learn from it, that if there should be some sort of attack, it's really, really important that we are, as a system, standing together and not responding individually, but responding sort of the whole system, all the universities, and not just in one country, but in a very, because this is what's happening in the US now, so they are entering into deals with this university and that university and so on. But if the whole university system said, sorry, we are not going to go there, I think the problem would at least have been a bit bigger. And the second issue is, in the US, what you can see is that now part of the research that was normally funded by public agencies is now replaced by private funding. And so our foundations are stepping in and saying, okay, we still think climate change would be a worse topic, or we step in to fund this and that. And so I think one other way of addressing this is to think about alternative funding schemes, because the more you depend on one source, the more you are under pressure if for some reason the political system changes. That's of course a long way to go, as we have hardly any other funding but the public. But in the US, at least at the moment, this works pretty well, and I've even talked to people that are working directly in climate and this and that, and some of them, because of the situation, get much more private funding now, because there's people believing that should be continued. So that's something else to think about.
Thank you. Florian Kramer, you know both systems. You know the American system, you know the European system. What would be your advice to Europeans in the sense of getting resilient in somehow whatever political developments may occur?
I think one important point, as we just heard, is coordination and working together and pushing back together, right? Again, if one university is getting attacked, and the situation in the US is a little bit different because you have private universities. I mean, the really big names are private universities, right? But if they would coordinate better and if they would get together and push back with one voice, I think that would help a lot. And I think that might actually be easier in Europe, where most of the universities are actually, state-funded and not private universities, right? But I guess it's hard. It depends a little bit on how the political system changes and how absolute the change is, right? I think we still have one big advantage in Europe compared to the US with this whole problem, and that is that the US is a two-party system, and one party switched completely, right? While here, you still have, in most cases, coalitions, right? You might still have one rational partner on board in a government that wants to push. And maybe the right ministry is going to stay with that rational partner and is not going with the other partner, right? So I think the system by itself might be a little bit more resilient, but you don't know what's happening. But I think coordination and pushing back is really the best way to do that.
We have already heard a little bit about the fact that Europe cannot really compensate for all those developments, negative developments that are currently taking place in the US. But on the other hand, we've also heard about programs, ideas, coordination efforts that are currently taking place, both at the national as well as the European level. But may I tease you a little bit with regards to the question, how can actually Europe become a giant in research and science? So what are the necessities, not to compensate, but nevertheless to move into the direction to somehow take over some of the issues, some of the funding that is currently under threat, or even breaking down all together that Europe can take over? Sibylle Wenke?
Big question, and I'm not sure that I can help in that, because still I would really sign all what has been said about the coordination, and I find this is of crucial importance. Also, measures the European Union is taking now to prepare the grounds for legally protection of science is tremendously important. But still, when we consider the numbers of funding and financing, it is still on the national level. We may not forget that the major part of the financial contribution to research and thing comes from the nations themselves. And so we have to, despite all the coordination on the European level, we have to still to rely on that, what is happening in our country. In Austria, we are quite well off to be in comparison with other countries when we see that it is above the magical 3% percent of the GDP coming for research and development of research. So we have also the necessity to concentrate on what we are doing in our country. And what happened actually, we saw in the US, we saw cuts to funding on a severe level. We saw travel restrictions and complete insecurity if we leave the country, we may come back. And we have all of a sudden a total increase in no open discourse in anything. So, and all these 3 points result to a loss in trust, a completely chaos in every personal, but also on the institutional level, and the result is a brain drain and academic freedom, which is completely endangered. And this we have to meet point by point, yes, that we are lucky to have a stable financial situation despite of all difficulties we have in general with our financial problems. We are able to ensure an international mobility within Europe, not so much in exchange with countries outside of Europe. And I think here we really have to do our homeworks, that we do not have the lovely speeches of international exchange, which are quite rudely stopped then at the visa counters in our countries. We have to rely on what Barbara Weidgruber has been saying so rightly. We have to keep up the dialogue. And we have to keep our promises towards our researchers, yes, that we have, on the one hand, we have the excellence, but also we provide a system which is worth doing research in.
I would like now to take a little turn towards research per se, because Carole mentioned in her statement that there is some danger that data that is coming from research, from science, from the US, maybe I describe it like that, ideologically driven, in the sense that we might not be able to rely 100% on the data to be scientific or being received in a scientific way, but has an ideological aspect to that. So what is the Science Foundation, for example, the FWF, doing with such information? I mean, if there is a risk going on that there might be indeed some research coming out that has an ideological but not a science perspective, how do you deal with such an issue that then probably also science projects built on this type of research that are then handed in at the FWF?
We are in a relatively comfortable situation that we have a very clear procedure for evaluating research proposals. And I mentioned it before, our only criterion is quality. This is even written in the law which describes our work. We have to trust that the international evaluation, and this is the second important pillar, all our projects are evaluated internationally. We will never have a written report from a person working in Austria. So we rely on a system that per construction is relatively unpolitical, namely based on excellence and driven by people who are don't have stakes in our research system because they work abroad. Mm-hmm. So this, I think, is a relatively strong safeguard against projects that try to bring in political aspects in some way or the other. They have to be excellent. Mm-hmm. That's the main criterion.
Mm-hmm. Now thinking about the Science Communication Center that is going to materialize, what role could such a Science Communication Center have in that respect? Maybe, Professor Schütze?
I think science communication is, of course, fundamental because in many ways, but especially if, in a democratic society, if you want to assure the right level of funding for science, you need to convince the majority of people that science is a good thing to have and needs to be funded in a reasonable way. So I think it's in the long term, this is a wonderful project, and I think it's very important also that we decided to join forces on this, to show this is not my science communication or your science communication or your science communication, but it's a joint effort. And but this is of course very long term, because we are trying to convince school kids and young adults that having a look at science might be worth doing, and maybe in a second moment come and join us at the university, or in a third moment come and join the academy in one of the institutes. But it's very long term, and this is only part of what we have to do, and this is catering especially to young people, but it's equally important to address more senior people, voters, to explain all over again every single day what we are doing and why it's worth doing. And I think it's probably worth not to concentrate so much on the so-called skeptics, which I don't think are really skeptical, because if you're skeptical, you need to understand what you're talking about first. But anyway, so that part of the population will be hard to address, but I think we have to focus on the reasonable part of voters and try to make what we do ever more visible, and that takes time. And researchers usually don't have much time, but if we understand it in the complexer whole, so it's about funding, but it's also, and very importantly, part of the broader society picture, and what, as you mentioned in the beginning, I mean, this is, or also the minister said in the beginning, this is about us, but it's very much about democratic societies at large. Academic freedom and the rest of the world are connected. So.
Last input from my side, and then I will open to the audience. I skimmed a little bit through the newspapers, New York Times, The Economist, and so on. And there were actually also a couple of people saying that indeed there are real problems in the way science and research works in the US. Namely, there is too much bureaucracy, there is too little time for research, that there are too many grant proposals, and therefore actually science papers are less disruptive, less innovative, but more of the same. So what can we learn in Europe here about this somehow
also negative perspective on how science and research so far has worked in order to somehow change or compensate or, create new institutions in order to avoid to make these mistakes. I may ask Carole Manchel-Blanchard. I think we do not yet hear you. You're still muted.
Sorry, apologize. No, I was making a joke and thanking you for associating bureaucracy with with Europe and sharing this question with me. No, jokes aside, I think, at all levels, and if I remember my studies of French law 30 years ago, simplification has always been on the agenda, and I think it's also still very much the case in what we need to do in order to, facilitate the participation in joint projects, facilitating a cooperation among research communities with the minimum amount of paperwork and administrative burdens. But still, the criteria of publication is the one that we take into account in order to measure the scientific level of countries in the innovation scoreboards, for instance, and these scientific papers, the US is still very high on that criteria, and we need to work on our side to fill in this gap that we have. Gap in competitiveness with the US and China, gap also in the capacity of our system to generate innovation. So this is very much on the agenda of the Commission for the time being in its proposal for the next framework program, but as was said several times, the funding of at European level on research and innovation is only 6% of the overall investment in Europe on for this sector. So we share very much the burden of improving the way we select our projects, and we facilitate cooperation among researchers.
Thank you. Looking at my watch, I realized that we have already extended the time a little bit. So therefore, at this stage, I would like to conclude, as Barbara Schober has mentioned before. Well, not really conclude, because Michael Wagner is coming in a second. But as Barbara Schober has mentioned before, there is time to somehow continue this discussion, then also later on with wine and some finger food. However, I think for me, this discussion has shown that we have only started it. I'm pretty sure after everything that we have heard so far and the numbers we have seen so far, this is definitely an issue that's going to be with us for many, many years probably to come, also with repercussions only to be seen in 15, 20 years, as has been mentioned also before. And therefore, even though the inputs were sometimes not so joyful and positive, I think we will have to keep an eye on what is going on, keep discussing about it, and also think what Europe and Austria can do in order to become resilient and also to be an important actor when it comes to science and research. So thank you very much to my panelists for having taken the time to come here, to share their insights with us, and also hopefully just to come again to our events in order to somehow discuss further developments. And with this, I hand now over to Michael Wagner for the concluding remarks.
Don't be concerned, there will not be long concluding remarks, because there was quite some consistency and redundancy with what you just said. So, mic is off? Okay, then I take yours. So, just want to say thank you again to all of you for being with us here tonight, and spending the last 1 or 2 hours with us discussing this important topic. We might revisit it. It was mentioned before that we might need another event on this in some time, so we will follow up on this. So we would like also to thank our speakers and panelists for all their insights and thoughtful discussions. Thank you very much for contributing to our event tonight. And I think the discussions have highlighted not only the challenges, but also the shared responsibility we have in safeguarding and strengthening science in Europe and beyond. And I think we have heard interesting ideas about a high-level panel identifying vulnerable points in the system and thinking about how we can better protect it from a change in the political system, or how can we increase the autonomy of universities. I think there would also, I've heard a lot about Europe, but also in Austria, I think we can do quite some steps maybe to increase the resilience of our system here. Funding is an important issue. I think this would be the worst time to decrease science funding now with these events going on in the US. So a lot to think about, and I invite you now to discuss, to continue these conversations informally over our vegetarian buffet outside, which is an excellent opportunity to exchange ideas, perspectives, and maybe even find some small solutions already for the next steps. So thank you again for being here, and enjoy the rest of the evening.